On the morning of October 14th, the air in the small Midwestern town carried the crispness of early fall. It was the kind of day that parents looked forward to when children ran free among pumpkins, hay rides rattled through cornfields, and the scent of warm cider drifted through the air. Families parked their cars in the uneven dirt lot of the local pumpkin patch, a family-owned farm that had, for years, been the backdrop of Halloween photos and carefree weekends. Parents chatted with friends they hadn't seen since last autumn. Children darted in and out of view, clutching bright orange pumpkins too large for their small arms. It felt safe, like nothing bad could ever happen there. Somewhere amid the laughter and bustle was a little girl, 7 years old, dressed in a light jacket against the chill, her hair pulled back neatly by her mother that morning. Her family had been planning this outing for weeks, a tradition to mark the start of the holiday season. She clung to her mother's hand as they bought tickets for the hayride, and for a while she stuck close. But pumpkin patches are busy, distracting places, stalls selling caramel apples, lines of wagons filled with gourds, crowds shifting between attractions. All of it created a maze in which a child could vanish in seconds. For her mother, it happened in the space of a distracted glance. She reached down to adjust her younger child's jacket, and when she looked back, the older girl was gone. At first, it didn't trigger panic, only a small frown and a scan of the nearby pumpkins. Children wandered constantly at the farm, and parents learned quickly not to overreact. But as the seconds ticked into minutes, her mother's voice rose, calling her daughter's name louder each time. People around her stopped to help, assuming the child was crouched behind a pumpkin or had wandered to the cider stand. Yet every shout went unanswered. The father, alerted by the mother's rising tone, began running through the patch, his eyes sweeping rows of orange shapes, scanning for a flash of his daughter's jacket. Strangers joined in, forming quick, uncoordinated search lines. Staff were called over the radio to check the barn, the corn maze, the petting zoo. Within 15 minutes, the carefree tone of the farm had shifted. Families corralled their children, whispers spread, and the laughter that had filled the air just an hour earlier had given way to unease. Farm workers quickly notified police, and the first squad cars rolled up within half an hour. Officers began locking down the exits, stopping vehicles as they tried to leave the dirt parking lot. Witnesses were questioned immediately. Had anyone seen a man holding a child or a girl running across the field toward the road? Most shook their heads. A few thought they might have noticed something, but their details were hazy, blended in with the blur of a crowded Saturday. Within the hour, the pumpkin patch had transformed from a place of joy into a place of fear. Uniformed officers walked the rows, flashlights in hand even though the sun was still up. Helicopters circled overhead, their noise cutting through the uneasy silence. Cars were turned away at checkpoints as deputies searched trunks and back seats. Parents gathered their own children close, ushering them to cars under the watch of armed officers. The festive decorations, hay bales, and pumpkin displays now stood in eerie contrast to the gravity of the moment. As night fell, the farm became a staging ground for a full-scale search. Volunteers from the town assembled, carrying flashlights, forming human chains across the darkened cornfields. Deputies used thermal imaging from the helicopter to detect heat signatures, hoping to spot a small body hidden in the stalks. Nothing appeared. The woods beyond the patch were combed, dogs brought in to follow scent trails that faded frustratingly near the barn. The girl's parents sat on the tailgate of a police truck, faces pale, hands clasped tightly together as they listened to investigators explain the procedure. They were told that, in missing child cases, the first 24 hours were critical. Every lead would be chased, every witness interviewed, but time was already slipping away. The parents could offer no explanation, no reason their daughter would have left willingly. She was not the type to run off. She was not angry. She had simply vanished. By midnight, the farm looked like a war zone of floodlights and uniforms. The once cheerful pathways were cordoned off with crime scene tape, evidence markers placed where small scuff marks or shoe prints might mean something. Neighbors arrived offering support, but left in silence, unable to look at the parents for long. The pumpkin patch that had welcomed hundreds that morning was now empty, save for investigators and the echoes of unanswered questions. And as the hours stretched into dawn, the reality began to sink in, not only for the family, but for the entire community. A child had disappeared from a crowded public place, surrounded by friends, neighbors, and strangers. She was there one moment, gone the next. No one had seen it happen, and no one knew where she had gone. What began as a normal autumn day had ended as every parent's nightmare. And for police, the investigation had only just begun. The first night of the search bled into the early hours of morning, and the atmosphere around the pumpkin patch shifted from shock to grim determination. By dawn, deputies from neighboring counties had arrived, bringing more resources to a scene that was already stretched thin. Helicopters roared above, their spotlights combing fields that seemed endless, while on the ground, deputies coordinated lines of volunteers to walk shoulder to shoulder through the mud. Parents held lanterns, teenagers carried flashlights, and seasoned officers tried to direct the chaos into order. Everyone knew the same thing. If the girl had simply wandered off, she could not have gotten far. Bloodhounds were brought in before sunrise, handlers carefully introducing them to the scent taken from the girl's jacket left in the family's car. The dogs darted toward the cornfields, noses pressed low to the soil, pulling their handlers into the rows. For a brief moment, hope surged. Their bodies tensed, their barks quickened. But after a few hundred feet, the trail went cold. Handlers explained that the scent had dissipated, scattered, or ended abruptly. It was as if she had walked partway into the corn and then vanished into thin air. Detectives began looking for physical barriers, something to explain her disappearance. They inspected the farm's perimeter, noting the fences that stretched around the fields. None were broken, none bent, none with holes large enough for a child to slip through. Officers checked ditches and drainage pipes, even crawling through culverts in case she had fallen or hidden inside. Each lead ended in disappointment. The pumpkin patch remained intact, untouched, as if mocking the urgency of the search. At the same time, roadblocks had been set up in every direction leading out of town. Drivers were stopped, their cars searched, trunks opened under the harsh glare of flashlights. License plates were recorded, drivers questioned. Police were looking for any vehicle that might have carried the child away. But hours passed, and not a single suspicious car matched the timing of the girl's disappearance. Traffic cameras from nearby highways were reviewed in real time, and still nothing. It left investigators with an unsettling thought. If she hadn't left in a car, where was she? Theories began to swirl, both within law enforcement and among the frightened volunteers. Some whispered that the girl must have simply gotten lost in the vastness of the cornfields, her small body missed by the searchers in the tall stalks. Others wondered if she had been lured or carried away, a kidnapping so quick and calculated that no one saw it happen. Detectives had to consider every possibility. They asked farm employees about strangers seen lingering near children, questioned whether anyone had noticed a man walking alone, or perhaps a woman leading a child who looked uncomfortable. Yet, in the flurry of festival crowds, no one could say for sure. By the second day, the search had widened miles beyond the farm. Boats were launched onto the nearby river to check along its banks. Divers braved the cold water, sweeping the muddy bottom with long poles in case her small frame had slipped beneath the surface. Nothing surfaced. Deputies knocked on doors in the surrounding neighborhoods, showing the girl's school photo, asking if anyone had seen her on the road or in a car window. All they received were sympathetic shakes of the head. The family remained at the farm during those first critical 48 hours, refusing to leave as long as the search was active. The mother clutched the girl's sweater, face streaked with exhaustion, repeating the same words to officers. Her daughter would never run away. She was careful, cautious, shy around strangers. If she had disappeared, something had happened to her. The father paced constantly, joining search lines, his boots caked in mud, eyes scanning ditches until nightfall forced him back to the command post. Neither parent allowed themselves to go home, haunted by the thought that their daughter might still be out there, frightened and waiting. As hours turned into days, tension inside the investigation mounted. Detectives divided into teams, one focused on the possibility of an abduction, another on the chance of a child lost in the terrain. Forensic technicians took soil samples, examined footprints in the mud, and photographed every scuff and indentation. A single shoe print briefly raised hope, but lab results later showed it belonged to one of the volunteers. Every apparent lead dissolved under scrutiny. On the third day, the sheriff called in the FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team. Agents arrived with their own specialists, criminal profilers, forensic experts, and advanced technology for mapping search grids. Interviews were conducted with precision, from farm employees to festival goers. Still, no credible suspect emerged. The agents were blunt in their assessment. Either the girl had gotten lost in a way that defied logic, or someone had removed her from the property with a level of planning that left almost no trace. Both scenarios were devastating. For the community, hope gave way to a heavy silence. Volunteers who had once rushed forward with flashlights and blankets began to fade back into their daily lives. The pumpkin patch, once bustling with families, closed indefinitely, its fields now scarred by tire tracks from law enforcement vehicles. Parents in town grew wary, keeping children close, haunted by the knowledge that if a child could vanish in a crowd, no one's safety was certain. By the end of that first week, the search had yielded nothing. No broken fence, no trail of clothing, no sign of a struggle. The official report described it bluntly. No indicators of abduction in plain sight, no physical evidence to suggest flight or concealment. Yet the absence of evidence only deepened the unease. A 7-year-old girl had walked into a pumpkin patch surrounded by hundreds of people, and somehow she had disappeared as if swallowed by the earth. For investigators, this was only the beginning. With no body, no witnesses, and no suspect, the case was already slipping toward a category they feared most, the kind that drags on without resolution. And in that silence, theories would multiply, suspicion would spread, and the pressure to find an answer would only grow heavier in the weeks to come. By the 5th day, with no trace of the missing girl in the fields or the woods, investigators shifted their focus inward. The scope of the search narrowed from distant highways and rivers back to the very people who had been on the farm that afternoon. Detectives began the painstaking process of interviewing every staff member, vendor, and family who had attended the pumpkin festival. What had started as a communal effort to find a lost child now turned into a community under a microscope. Farm employees were the first to feel the weight of suspicion. The sheriff's office combed through their backgrounds, scrutinizing financial records, criminal histories, and any trace of misconduct. Each worker was questioned for hours, their timelines dissected in detail. Had anyone left their station for longer than a few minutes? Had anyone seen the girl near the barns, the storage sheds, or the parking lot? Employees repeated their accounts until they were hoarse, some breaking down under the pressure. None of their stories offered clarity. They all claimed the same thing. The girl was there. And then she was gone. Vendors, too, were questioned. The woman at the caramel apple stand said she didn't recall seeing the child, though she served dozens of customers that afternoon. The man running the hayride insisted the girl never boarded his wagon. Another recalled faintly seeing a child running through the rows, but when pressed, admitted he couldn't be certain it was her. Memory, muddied by the chaos of a festival, became unreliable. Each testimony added to a growing web of possibilities, but no definitive lead. Soon the whispers began. Parents exchanged quiet suspicions in grocery stores and church parking lots. Some claimed they saw a man carrying a child out of the patch that day. But when asked for details, what color jacket, what direction he walked, what kind of car he drove, the accounts unraveled into vague impressions. Others leaned into darker speculation, suggesting there must have been some kind of family dispute, something hidden beneath the surface that explained why the girl had disappeared. Detectives followed up, interviewing relatives, examining custody arrangements, searching for tension in the household. They found grief, despair, and exhaustion, but no evidence of guilt. The The girl's parents became the reluctant center of public scrutiny. The mother, who at first sounded the alarm, faced subtle questions about how closely she had been watching her child. The father, frustrated and volatile, clashed openly with officers, demanding faster results. Their marriage strained under the glare of suspicion, every word and action interpreted through the lens of doubt. To detectives, their behavior was consistent with desperate parents clinging to hope. To neighbors, it was fuel for gossip. Detectives pressed further into the community. They canvassed nearby farms, questioned residents living along the back roads, and asked if anyone had noticed a vehicle parked oddly that day. A handful of tips trickled in. One man said he noticed a dark pickup leaving the area in a rush. Another described a van he didn't recognize near the tree line. Police chased each lead, running plates, knocking on doors, but all ended in dead ends. Either the vehicles belonged to legitimate visitors, or they were long gone before officers arrived. In the absence of answers, suspicion grew into something corrosive. The once trusted pumpkin patch, a place where families had gathered for decades, became a symbol of fear. Parents no longer wanted to take their children there, even after it reopened. Vendors who had worked the event faced sideways glances in town. The farmers who owned the land bore the heaviest burden, whispered about as if they had failed to protect the children under their care. Though no evidence pointed to their involvement, the stigma clung to them, leaving them isolated from the very community they had served for years. Inside the sheriff's office, the case file thickened with interview transcripts, but the evidence remained thin. A composite sketch of a man carrying a child circulated briefly, but it was built on details so vague it could have been anyone. Without surveillance footage, without a clear witness, the sketch only added to the uncertainty. Detectives admitted privately that they were chasing shadows. Every rumor they investigated dissolved. Every theory collapsed under scrutiny. The weight of the girl's absence pressed hardest on her family. Their home filled with flyers, candles, and photographs, a constant reminder of the child missing from the dinner table. They clung to each other in moments, but the strain often tore them apart. One parent believed firmly in abduction, convinced their daughter was out there somewhere, waiting to be found. The other, weary from unanswered questions, began to retreat into silence, burdened by guilt they couldn't explain. That divide would only widen as weeks turned into months. For the broader community, unease turned to distrust. Parents who had once left their children to roam freely at fairs and festivals now clutched their hands tightly, fearful of the smallest distraction. Friendships strained under the weight of rumor. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion, wondering if the person living next door had seen something or done something they hadn't admitted. The disappearance of one child fractured the sense of safety the town had always taken for granted. And yet, despite every suspicion cast and every theory tested, nothing held. No arrests were made, no charges were filed. The investigation, once so urgent and determined, began to slow. Leads dried up, officers returned to other duties, and the pumpkin patch case drifted closer to a silent shelf reserved for mysteries that seemed unsolvable. The parents remained fractured, the community uneasy, and trust broken in ways that could not be repaired. But while the case stalled on paper, the absence of resolution kept the story alive in whispers and rumors. People could not let it go. Some were certain it had been an abduction. Others believed something darker was buried in the land itself. And though no one knew the truth at the time, years later, the farm would reveal secrets far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Detectives knew by the second week that traditional searches would not be enough. Theories had spread like wildfire, and without a body, without even a clear sign of struggle, the case was becoming harder to control. To push further, investigators turned to forensics. Specialists arrived with equipment most rural towns had never seen. Large devices capable of ground-penetrating radar were wheeled into the fields, their antennas sweeping back and forth across the soil. Every dip in the earth, every pocket of disturbed ground, was analyzed on monitors. The hope was simple. If the girl had been buried on the property, or if something of hers had been hidden there, the machines would find it. Cadaver dogs were deployed alongside the technology. Handlers led them through the corn maze, across the hayrides, and along the fence lines, watching closely for a signal. The dogs alerted several times, noses pressing to the ground, tails stiff. But when investigators dug into the soil, they found nothing more than decomposing animal remains. Coyotes, raccoons, and farm dogs had all left their imprint on the land, clouding the search with false hope. Each failed dig carried the same sting. Another possibility tested, another disappointment recorded in the case file. Detectives also relied on aerial photography, using both helicopters and small drones to capture high-resolution images of the patch. They studied the pictures for patterns, searching for signs of freshly disturbed earth, hidden paths, or tire tracks leading to secluded areas. At first glance, several sections appeared suspicious. Soil darker than its surroundings, rows of corn trampled in unusual directions. But when teams reached those locations on the ground, they uncovered only the mundane signs of farm life. Equipment had been moved, irrigation had shifted the dirt, children had cut through rows in play. Nothing pointed to the missing girl. Then came the discovery that briefly reignited hope. Near the back edge of the pumpkin patch, an officer spotted a partial shoe print in the mud. The tread pattern looked smaller than an adult's, perhaps the size of a child's shoe. It was measured, photographed, and preserved, treated as if it might finally be the first true link to her trail. For days, investigators clung to that possibility. They sent the impression for analysis, compared it with the shoes her mother insisted she had worn that day. The match seemed close enough to matter. DNA swabs were taken from soil lodged inside the print. Weeks later, the results came back with a crushing verdict. The print was too degraded to confirm. The tread design was common, shared by hundreds of children's brands, and the soil yielded no usable DNA. What had felt like a breakthrough dissolved into another dead end, a familiar pattern in the investigation. The farm itself soon bore the brunt of frustration. With no suspect to focus on, the community turned its anger toward the landowners. Parents whispered that they had failed to protect their guests. Why weren't there more cameras, more staff patrolling the grounds? Rumors painted the owners as negligent, some even hinting at hidden involvement. In reality, the farmers had cooperated fully, opening every barn, every storage shed, even allowing their personal property to be searched. But in the eyes of a community desperate for answers, their cooperation wasn't enough to clear them. Their livelihood, once rooted in family-friendly tradition, began to collapse under suspicion. Attendance at the patch had dwindled. Vendors pulled out, unwilling to work a place associated with tragedy. The farmers' children faced whispers at school, their friends' parents no longer allowing them to visit the property. Even their church pew sat empty, shunned by neighbors who couldn't look at them without thinking of the missing girl. No evidence tied them to the crime, yet the shadow of guilt clung to them regardless. Meanwhile, investigators kept the farm under constant scrutiny. Soil samples were tested for traces of decomposition gases. Wells were inspected for signs of disturbance. Storage buildings were emptied, floorboards pried up, concrete scanned for anomalies. Every forensic angle was exhausted, every possibility checked. Each negative result deepened the frustration of the officers who had sworn to find her. Behind closed doors, the case file grew thicker, but less hopeful. Detectives debated theories late into the night. Some argued she'd been abducted quickly and taken off the property before police could respond, explaining why forensics showed nothing. Others believed she was still hidden somewhere on the land, buried in a way too precise for their tools to detect. Without evidence, neither side could win the argument, and so the case lingered in the uncomfortable space between. For the family, each new test and each new failure chipped away at hope. They sat through briefings, listened to scientific explanations of radar scans and chemical tests, but all they heard was the same outcome: nothing found. The mother's eyes dulled from sleepless nights. The father's voice grew harder each time he spoke to the press. Their daughter had vanished on land full of witnesses, yet every forensic tool in modern policing had failed to bring them closer to the truth. As months passed, the pumpkin patch itself became a symbol of unease. Its once bright fields of orange lay abandoned, overrun with weeds. Crime scene tape had long been taken down, but no one came back to pick pumpkins or ride the hay wagon. The community had written it off as cursed, a place no longer safe for children. The owners, though never charged, were ostracized, left to shoulder blame for something they could not prove they hadn't done. And while detectives worked to reassure the family and public that the search wasn't over, in private, many admitted they were out of leads. Forensics had yielded nothing. Theories had gone nowhere. The girl remained missing, the farm stained by suspicion, and the investigation stalled. Yet, in the silence of that failure, a deeper truth was already buried in the soil, one that would only come to light years later when the land changed hands and secrets long hidden finally surfaced. As weeks turned into months, the missing girl's case shifted from an active hunt to a long, slow vigil. The farm was searched and researched, tips called in and followed, suspects questioned and cleared. Yet no trace of the child emerged. Each year that passed without answers hollowed out her family in ways that no one could repair. The weight of absence became a fixture in their home, shaping everything from the words they spoke to the silences they shared. Her mother refused to surrender hope. On the anniversary of her disappearance, she printed new flyers, updating them with the girl's age progression images provided by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. She stapled them to telephone poles, taped them to store windows, and handed them out at church gatherings. Her house became a shrine of reminders, photos on every wall, the girl's backpack preserved in her bedroom, birthday cakes baked each year though no one sat to eat them. She spoke to reporters, appeared on local television, begged for information. Her grief was loud, public, insistent. Her father grieved differently. The early months saw him on search teams, trudging through muddy fields and forests alongside deputies, his hands blistered from carrying flashlights and shovels. But as time dragged on, something hardened in him. He grew quieter, his anger no longer spilling outward but folding in on itself. He stopped talking to journalists, refused interviews, and dismissed candlelight vigils as empty gestures. In his silence, bitterness took root. Friends noticed his absence from community gatherings. Neighbors remarked on the way he avoided eye contact. To many, it looked like resignation. For the siblings left behind, childhood became something lived in the shadow of the missing. Teachers described them as distracted, withdrawn, always aware of being the children of tragedy. Every milestone, birthdays, graduations, holidays, was marked not by celebration, but by the reminder of who wasn't there. Photos taken by relatives always included an empty chair or a framed picture of their sister, an unspoken reminder that their lives were defined by absence. They learned early that their family was fractured in ways other families weren't, and the strain of that identity followed them into adolescence. Meanwhile, inside the sheriff's office, the case was quietly slipping toward obscurity. Detectives rotated off, the file as new assignments pulled them elsewhere. Each fresh set of eyes brought optimism, the belief that overlooked evidence might be the key. But after weeks of combing through the same interviews, the same reports, hope dulled. Leads went cold almost as quickly as they arrived. Files were boxed, stacked in corners, collecting dust as one year faded into the next. What had once been the town's most urgent crisis was now becoming a ghost story, spoken of in hushed tones, passed along like folklore. The community, too, adapted to the silence. In the first year, prayer circles gathered weekly, and church bulletins printed the girl's name alongside calls for vigilance. But as anniversaries piled up, participation waned. Life moved forward for those not directly tied to the tragedy. New families came to town, unfamiliar with the case, unaware of the child whose face had once been stapled to every telephone pole. For those who did remember, the story took on the rhythm of myth, retold at gatherings, distorted by rumor, shaped by speculation rather than fact. The farm itself remained scarred. Though investigators never proved wrongdoing by its owners, the land carried a stigma. Families avoided it, vendors refused to return, and what had once been a thriving business faded into ruin. The fields went fallow, barns stood empty, and the silence of abandonment spread across acres that had once been filled with children's laughter. The owners, shunned by neighbors, sold the property at a loss, forced to carry the burden of blame they could never shake. For the mother, each sale sign, each closed door, felt like another layer of her daughter's story being buried. She doubled her efforts, writing letters to governors, sending case files to national talk shows, begging anyone to spotlight the disappearance. Most never responded. The father by then had stopped engaging altogether. He worked longer hours, spoke less, and when he did speak of his daughter, it was often to say he believed she was gone. Their marriage, once held together by shared grief, began to unravel. Arguments turned into long silences, and silences into separate lives lived under the same roof. By the 11th year, their home bore the marks of a family divided by time and sorrow. Her mother's hope remained, fragile but alive, sustained by the belief that someday a clue would surface, that the right person would finally come forward. Her father lived in resignation, avoiding her gaze when she taped new flyers to the refrigerator. The siblings, now old enough to recognize the permanence of loss, carried the quiet anger of lives shaped by tragedy not of their making. And yet, while the family struggled to endure, the truth of what happened that day still lay hidden, just out of reach. The case had grown cold, the files dusty, but the land itself had not given up its secret, a secret that would not remain buried forever. Nearly 11 years had passed since the day the IEU little girl vanished from the pumpkin patch, and for most people in town, the case had faded into a story told in fragments, softened by time. But for her family, the absence remained sharp, cutting into every season, every holiday, every anniversary. The farm where she was last seen had long since been abandoned, its reputation destroyed by suspicion and tragedy. Eventually, it was sold to a new family of farmers, people with no connection to the disappearance, only the hope of restoring the land to something productive. When they first walked the fields, they saw neglect. The orchards were overgrown, barns sagged under years of disuse, and weeds had overtaken what had once been rows of pumpkins. Their work was slow, clearing brush, turning soil, and reclaiming space. They thought little of the land's history beyond the whispers they occasionally overheard in town. For them, it was a place to start fresh, but as they began digging deeper into the soil, they uncovered things that didn't fit. The first discovery was small. Near the edge of the orchard, buried just beneath the top layer of dirt, they found a set of brightly colored hair ties, faded from years underground. At first, they dismissed it as trash, perhaps left behind by visitors during the patch's busier days. Children lost things all the time. Still, the placement felt strange. Why would hair ties be buried, not dropped? They set them aside without much thought and kept working. Weeks later, another object surfaced. While plowing a section near the old hay storage, the farmer's wife spotted fabric twisted into the soil. It was torn, discolored, almost unrecognizable after so many years. She pulled it free and saw that it was a fragment of cloth patterned faintly with pink flowers. Again, it could have been nothing. The land had hosted countless children, their belongings easily scattered and lost. But the way it was wedged into the dirt unsettled her. She mentioned it to her husband, who reassured her it was likely just a remnant from the festival crowds. Still, she kept it, folded away with the hair ties. The third discovery was different. One afternoon, while clearing debris near the far end of the property, the husband's shovel struck something metallic. Expecting a piece of rusted farm equipment, he knelt and brushed back the dirt. What he uncovered was a small necklace chain, rusted and dulled, with a pendant still attached. Its shape was faint but distinct enough to recognize as a heart. He carried it back to the house, unsure if it was valuable or worthless, only that it seemed out of place buried so far from where visitors would have walked. When his wife saw it, her face went pale. She remembered the old flyers that had once covered the town, the photograph of the missing girl, the small heart-shaped pendant hanging from her neck. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of recognition sinking in. Unlike hair ties or fabric, this was something personal, specific, and instantly connected to the child who had never come home. The farmers debated what to do. For years, they had tried to separate themselves from the land's tragic past. They had avoided conversations about what had happened, wanting their children to grow up without the shadow of rumor. But holding that rusted necklace made denial impossible. They realized the objects weren't random, not just discarded festival trash. Together, they decided they had no choice but to call the authorities. When detectives returned to the property after more than a decade, they were met with unease. Many of the original officers had long since retired or moved on, but the case still lingered in the department's files, cold but never forgotten. The necklace reignited everything. It was collected carefully, photographed, and bagged as evidence. The other trinkets, the hair ties, the fabric, were taken as well. Investigators were cautious. After years of false leads and community suspicion, they knew how easily hope could collapse. Tests would be required to confirm whether the pendant truly belonged to the girl, though her mother had insisted at the time of her disappearance that her daughter never went anywhere without it. Forensic experts examined the rusted chain, looking for DNA traces, though the odds after so many years in the soil were slim. News of the discovery spread quietly at first, whispered through the town the way rumors always did. The pumpkin patch, long abandoned, was once again at the center of attention. For the girl's mother, the call from detectives was both devastating and vindicating. She had kept every flyer, every age progression image, every scrap of hope. And now, finally, there was something concrete, an object that once hung around her daughter's neck. The father, more cautious, worried it would lead nowhere, another painful reminder without answers. Still, the family could not ignore what had been found. The farmers told investigators about another detail, something that had unsettled them from the start. When they purchased the land, the previous owners had given them instructions never to disturb the ground near the hay storage area. At the time, they thought little of it, assuming it related to drainage issues or old farm equipment buried underneath. But paired with the discoveries, the warning took on a more sinister meaning. Why would anyone care so specifically about one small section of earth? For detectives, it was enough to bring resources back to the property to prepare for a more thorough search. For the family, it stirred emotions long buried, hope colliding with fear, grief resurfacing with new intensity. After more than a decade of silence, the land itself was beginning to speak. And in that moment, with trinkets pulled from the soil and a rusted necklace tied to the memory of a missing child, the investigation shifted once again. Something had always been hidden on that farm, and it was only a matter of time before the truth would be unearthed. When detectives returned to the farm, the new owners did not meet them with hostility or defensiveness. Instead, they carried the heavy look of people who had lived too long with something unsettling in the back of their minds. The discovery of the necklace had cracked open memories they had tried to ignore, strange instructions from the previous landholders that made little sense at the time, but now seemed impossible to dismiss. Sitting across from investigators at their kitchen table, the couple admitted that when they purchased the land, the former owners gave them explicit warnings: never dig too deeply near the hay storage area. They were told it was unstable ground, prone to water pooling and erosion, and disturbing it might create drainage problems. At first, they accepted the explanation. Farmers often knew their land's quirks better than anyone else, but the warning had stuck with them, delivered in a tone that felt oddly insistent, almost rehearsed. For years, they worked around the area, plowing the fields and clearing brush, but leaving the patch near the old storage untouched. The hay barn itself had long since collapsed, but the ground beside it seemed stubborn, harder to till, as though something lay beneath the soil that resisted their efforts. They ignored it, focusing on other parts of the farm. But as time passed and they grew comfortable on the property, curiosity began to gnaw at them. Why had the instructions been so specific? Why just that one patch? The husband admitted that one season, while running his plow closer than usual to the restricted spot, he felt the ground shift beneath the blade. The soil turned up differently, looser, darker, and filled with debris unlike the surrounding earth. He slowed the machine, uneasy, and eventually stopped. Standing over the disturbed soil, he realized it didn't look like normal farmland. The ground seemed tampered with, as if it had been dug up and refilled long before they arrived. He chose not to tell his wife at first, brushing it off as nothing. But the thought lingered, resurfacing whenever he passed the barn. It was only after they found the necklace and reported it to police that the farmers shared the full story. They confessed that they had always suspected something was wrong with that part of the property, but without proof. They had tried to convince themselves it was just their imagination. Now, with the evidence recovered from the orchard, the weight of that suspicion became too heavy to carry. They admitted to detectives that they had, on occasion, dug shallowly into the soil themselves, trying to put their unease to rest. Each time, they found strange resistance, layers of compacted earth that felt deliberately packed down. Nothing ever surfaced, but the unease grew stronger with every attempt. The detectives listened carefully, making notes. For them, the admission was crucial. It wasn't just a random discovery of trinkets anymore. It was a pattern of behavior, a warning from the past owners, and a physical sign of disturbed soil in exactly the kind of place where something could be hidden. They asked the farmers to walk them to the spot. Together, they crossed the overgrown fields, past rotting fence posts and weathered storage sheds, until they reached the old hay barn. The farmers pointed to a rectangular section of ground about 20 feet from the collapsed structure. To the untrained eye, it looked no different than the rest of the farm, just another patch of earth marked by weeds and tire tracks. But to those who had worked the land for years, it stood out. It had never settled properly, never grown crops evenly, and always looked slightly different when the sun hit it at dusk. Investigators marked the area, staking off the boundaries for excavation. They brought in specialists again, this time with renewed focus. Ground-penetrating radar was dragged across the surface, producing images that were inconclusive but suggested irregularities several feet below. The dogs were walked over the site, noses twitching, bodies stiffening at points but unable to give a definitive alert. It was enough to make detectives pause, enough to convince them that digging here might finally yield something concrete. For the farmers, confessing this unease lifted a burden. They admitted they had lived with guilt, fearing that by ignoring the warning and doing nothing, they had left a secret buried. They worried what might be uncovered, not only for the sake of their family, but for the town that still lived with unanswered questions. Yet they also knew that silence had allowed rumors to thrive for over a decade. It was time to let the land speak. Back at the sheriff's office, the discovery reignited old tensions. Some detectives, long resigned to the case being unsolvable, were suddenly faced with the possibility that the truth had been hidden in plain sight all along. Others were cautious, warning that disturbed soil didn't always mean foul play. But the combination of the necklace, the trinkets, and the farmer's quiet confession painted a picture too stark to ignore. For the family of the missing girl, the news reached them in fragments, calls from reporters, whispers from neighbors, then finally, direct confirmation from law enforcement. The mother's hopes surged, tempered by years of disappointment. The father, worn down by silence, admitted privately that he feared what would be found. Either way, they both knew the ground beneath that hay barn was no longer just earth. It was a graveyard of unanswered questions. The stage was set for excavation, for the moment when machinery and shovels would pierce the soil that had hidden its secret for more than a decade. The farmers had unburdened themselves, but what lay beneath their land was something far heavier than they had ever imagined. When the decision was made to excavate, the patch of soil near the collapsed hay barn, the atmosphere on the farm shifted. For weeks, speculation had hovered over the land, fueled by trinkets and confessions, but now there was no avoiding it. Deputies cordoned off the area, crime scene tape fluttered in the wind, and heavy equipment was rolled in under the watch of forensic experts. The farmers who had come forward stood at a distance, their faces drawn, as though they already knew what would be found. The digging began cautiously. Layers of soil peeled back in measured increments, each load sifted and examined before being carried away. Investigators expected resistance from the earth, but what unsettled them most was how uneven the soil felt, as though it had been tampered with long ago. Within hours, they reached a layer that looked different, darker, looser, filled with debris that did not match the untouched ground surrounding it. The site was quickly declared a point of interest, and shovels replaced machines as gloved hands carefully scraped away the dirt. The first discovery was a fragment of fabric, stained, deteriorated, but still identifiable as clothing. Forensic technicians halted the work, photographing the site, marking the position, and lifting it gently into evidence bags. Then came the bones. Small, delicate, scattered through the soil in a way that left no doubt they had belonged to a child. Silence fell across the site as the reality settled in. What had been rumor and suspicion for more than a decade was now tangible, undeniable. The missing girl had never left the farm. She had been here all along, buried beneath the ground that families once walked across in search of pumpkins. Detectives crouched low, studying the positioning. This was no shallow grave dug in panic. It had been carefully concealed, layers of farm debris piled on top, old hay, broken wood, discarded equipment, all designed to make the area look natural. It explained why radar had been inconclusive years earlier, why dogs had given partial alerts, but never enough to act on. Whoever had done this had known how to hide something in plain sight. As the excavation continued, more pieces surfaced. Soil-stained belongings emerged one by one. A shoe, cracked and weathered from years underground. A rusted zipper from what appeared to be a small jacket. And finally, a pendant chain tangled in the dirt, the match to the necklace discovered weeks earlier. Each item was collected with painstaking care, cataloged as evidence, and carried to waiting forensic vans. For the investigators on scene, the effect was devastating. They had spent years looking outward, chasing vehicles, suspects, and theories, when the truth had been beneath their feet. The sheriff called the girl's parents personally. The news was delivered with the same bluntness that accompanies all grim discoveries. Remains consistent with a child had been found on the farm. The mother collapsed, her worst fear confirmed after years of clinging to hope. The father sat in silence, tears falling without words, the bitterness of years of searching overtaken by a hollow ache. For them, the confirmation was not closure, but a reopening of wounds that had never truly healed. The farm once again became the epicenter of a community's grief. Media swarmed the property, helicopters hovered, and headlines blared the words, "Remains found." Neighbors who had whispered rumors now whispered apologies, yet suspicion reignited all the same. Who had buried her here? Why had the landowners before insisted the soil remain untouched? How had investigators missed this spot despite years of searching? Forensic anthropologists were called in to examine the bones, estimating time of death and searching for signs of trauma. The condition of the remains suggested they had been in the ground for more than a decade, aligning with the timeline of the girl's disappearance. Clothing fragments matched the description her mother had given that day. A light jacket, patterned fabric. It was enough to eliminate doubt. This was her. But the discovery raised more questions than it answered. If she had been buried here from the beginning, how had no one seen it happen? The pumpkin patch had been crowded, the farm bustling with families. To place a body here required opportunity, privacy, and knowledge of the land. Detectives began combing through old employee records, reviewing names of workers who had been present that day. Their focus shifted toward those who had access to the hay storage, people who could move unnoticed behind the barns while the chaos of the festival distracted others. The farmers who had uncovered the trinkets now felt the weight of their confession in full. They admitted privately to investigators that they had always feared something lay beneath their soil, but even they had not imagined this. The patch they had been told to avoid was not about drainage at all. It had been a warning designed to keep the truth buried. As the remains were carried away in discreet black bags, the town braced itself for what would follow. The land had finally given up its secret, but the identity of the person who had put the girl there remained hidden. Investigators knew the excavation was only the beginning. Forensic testing would confirm what the soil already suggested. Witness interviews, long forgotten, would be revisited. And somewhere in the paper trail of that farm's history lay the name of the person who had buried a child beneath layers of hay and silence. The grim discovery closed one chapter, but opened another, darker one. The girl's family now had confirmation of what they had feared, but not yet the justice they had waited for. And in the quiet aftermath of the excavation, detectives prepared to follow the trail left behind, determined to answer the question that still lingered. Who had placed her in that soil, and how it had gone unnoticed for so long? In the weeks following the EBU's excavation, investigators pored over the evidence with renewed urgency. The remains had been confirmed as belonging to the missing girl, and with that confirmation came the need to answer the question that now haunted the case. Who had buried her there? Detectives went back to the beginning, re-examining every name, every report, every overlooked detail from the original investigation. What they found was less like a new lead and more like a thread that had been sitting in the file for over a decade, waiting to be pulled. Personnel records from the farm revealed something unsettling. Among the seasonal workers hired for the pumpkin patch that year was a man who had arrived suddenly, worked only briefly, and then disappeared from the area shortly after the girl went missing. At the time, his absence had not raised alarms. Farm labor was transient, and workers often drifted in and out without notice. But in light of the discovery, his vanishing act now looked far more suspicious. Digging deeper into his history, detectives found troubling details. He had prior arrests in another state, charges related to misconduct around children that had never led to conviction, but painted a disturbing picture. His employment records were inconsistent, gaps in his resume hidden by temporary farm jobs in different counties. He had been described as quiet, reserved, someone who kept to himself around the other workers. That quiet had once seemed unremarkable. Now it seemed like camouflage. Detectives pulled old interview transcripts, conversations with festival vendors and staff that had been conducted in the chaotic days after the disappearance. One vendor, running the hayride that afternoon, recalled seeing the man near the barns, looking restless, pacing back and forth. Another employee remembered him leaving his assigned post more than once, returning flustered, sweating, though the day had not been particularly hot. At the time, those details had been logged but dismissed. He wasn't the only person acting strangely in the panic of a missing child. But with the benefit of hindsight, those behaviors began to align with something far darker. Witnesses who had been children at the time came forward now as adults, their memories hazy but weighted with unease. A teenager who had worked the caramel apple stand recalled the man speaking briefly to the missing girl earlier in the day. He hadn't thought much of it then, but looking back, he remembered the child appearing hesitant, glancing around as if unsure whether to answer. Another visitor described seeing a man who fit his description carrying something across the field, though in the confusion, they could not say for certain it was a child. These fragments, scattered and uncertain when first collected, now began to take shape. Investigators pieced together a narrative that was both chilling and plausible. The man had opportunity. His role at the farm gave him access to the barns and storage areas, where visibility was low. He had motive, at least in the sense of a troubling past that suggested a dangerous interest in children. And he had the perfect cover, a festival teeming with families, noise, and distractions where one moment's inattention was all it took for a child to slip away unnoticed. In the chaos, no one questioned him walking behind the barn. No one stopped him from digging later in a spot already cluttered with farm debris. The most haunting realization came when detectives revisited the warnings passed down to the new farmers. The insistence from the prior owners never to dig near the hay storage suggested more than just negligence. It implied knowledge. Perhaps they had suspected, perhaps they had feared the truth but never confronted it. Whether they were complicit or simply afraid of what they might find, their silence had allowed the secret to remain buried for 11 years. Tracking the man down proved difficult. He had left the state not long after the girl vanished, drifting between low-paying jobs under false names. But eventually, Through a series of employment checks and archived tax records, detectives located him. He had lived quietly, moving often, leaving behind little more than temporary addresses. His sudden disappearance from the farm now looked deliberate, a way of slipping away before suspicion could tighten around him. When investigators compiled the evidence into a coherent timeline, the story was hard to ignore. A troubled employee with a documented history of inappropriate behavior, witnesses recalling his erratic actions on the day of the disappearance, his unexplained absence from his assigned work area, his vanishing act from the community shortly afterward, and finally, the girl's remains buried on the very property he had access to. Each piece alone was circumstantial. Together, they painted a narrative too consistent to dismiss. For the family, the revelation was shattering. To learn that their daughter's killer had not been a faceless stranger, but someone working under the banner of a trusted community event was almost too much to bear. The mother's anger, long buried beneath years of grief, reignited as she demanded answers about why he had not been investigated more thoroughly at the time. The father, worn by silence, could only shake his head at the realization that the truth had been within reach from the very beginning, yet overlooked. For investigators, the focus shifted from discovery to accountability. They had found the girl's remains, and now they had a likely suspect. But proving the case beyond doubt would require more than inference. Forensic teams combed the property again, searching for items that could tie directly to him. Tools, fibers, traces of DNA missed the first time. Every interview was revisited, every report scrutinized. What had once been fragments were now being assembled into a chilling but coherent narrative. And yet, despite the mounting evidence, one question lingered in every detective's mind. If the man had buried the child so carefully, concealed her beneath layers of soil and debris, how had he done it unnoticed in the chaos of that day? Who had looked the other way, and why had it taken over a decade for the truth to finally emerge? Those were the answers that would come next, when the investigation moved from suspicion to confrontation. 11 years after the girl vanished, the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place, bringing clarity to a case that had haunted a community for more than a decade. Investigators reconstructed the last known moments of her life with painstaking care, retracing her path behind the storage barns on the edge of the farm. Witness accounts, once scattered and inconsistent, now aligned. She had wandered past the main festival area, curious and unaware of the danger that awaited. The man, the seasonal employee whose sudden disappearance had gone unexamined, had been in that precise location at that precise time. When police delved into his work history, the record revealed a pattern of concealed misconduct. Prior complaints, employment gaps, and subtle disciplinary notes formed a chain of evidence previously ignored. It painted a portrait of a man who had been able to move between towns, between jobs, carrying a risk no one had identified until now. The discovery of the girl's remains had forced the reopening of old files, and suddenly the warnings, the odd behavior observed that day, and his disappearance after the festival became part of a chilling narrative. Forensic analysis confirmed what investigators suspected. The soil-stained belongings and fragments of clothing had been placed deliberately. The girl had been silenced in a moment of panic, her life ending abruptly behind the barns where she had strayed. The employee had acted quickly, burying her beneath layers of debris and soil, taking advantage of the isolation and the chaotic environment of the festival to conceal the crime. He had threatened others into silence, ensuring that no one spoke of what they might have seen, and then vanished from the community, leaving the secret to linger for over a decade. The farmers who had stumbled upon the patch of disturbed soil years later were both horrified and instrumental in bringing the truth to light. Their curiosity, once trivial, had shattered the silence the man had relied upon. The rusted necklace, the fragments of fabric, and the remnants of hair ties had been the first signals that something remained hidden. Each item, unearthed slowly and methodically, confirmed that the girl's disappearance had never been random or accidental. It had been calculated and concealed with deliberate intent. Investigators meticulously connected the timelines, the hidden misconduct, and the recovered evidence. Statements from neighbors and witnesses were cross-referenced, highlighting a chain of behavior consistent with the employee's presence behind the barns. It became clear that no external stranger had been involved. The danger had been inside the farm, masked by the normalcy of festival preparations and the routine of seasonal labor. The revelations were deeply unsettling to those who had once trusted the farm and its operations. Ultimately, law enforcement presented a comprehensive case that traced the girl's final movements, the employee's actions, and the steps he took to cover his tracks. While he had fled and remained beyond reach for years, the discovery of the burial site and corroborating evidence created a narrative that explained everything. The case closed with certainty, the lingering questions of her fate finally answered, yet the weight of lost years and the innocence stolen remained undeniable. For the family, the confirmation of what had happened brought a bitter mixture of relief and grief. They could finally understand the truth, see how the events had unfolded, and reconcile with the fact that the girl's disappearance had been intentional, not an accident or an unsolved mystery. 11 years of unanswered questions, fear, and uncertainty had come to an end, yet the emotional scars remained etched in every recollection of the festival, the farm, and the quiet path behind the barns. The community, once unsettled by the inexplicable absence of the girl, faced the stark realization that evil had lingered in plain sight, hidden beneath layers of soil, bureaucracy, and fear. The farmers who had uncovered the remains, the detectives who painstakingly pieced together the story, and the family who had endured over a decade of waiting all carried the aftermath of the revelation. It was a case resolved, a mystery concluded, but the shadows of lost time and stolen innocence lingered long after the evidence had been catalogued and the investigation officially closed.